No mai hoki mai kia the fold, I mihi nei ko Anna Rawhiti-Connell tōku ingoa. In February this year, a report from the AFR sparked rumours about significant changes at the highest levels of NZME. After 4 months of headlines, manoeuvring and frankly expressed views and analysis, the story of billionaire investor Jim Grenon's bid for control of the NZME board concluded yesterday at the company's annual shareholder meeting, where it was less a bloody coup and more a negotiated compromise. Host of the Fold, Duncan Greive, was at the NZME meeting and swaps into the guest chair to discuss a massive day of media news. Duncan, hi.
Kia ora, Anna.
How are you after the NZME annual shareholder meeting?
I'm good. This is a day that has glittered in the distance for quite some time. So to have it come here, and not only that, but for staff to just lob their bomb into the sort of preamble, it's been a day. You know, we're recording this at just before 5 p.m. and it's been a real foldy day.
It has. You've been this is your second time on the mic, so huge news. So I think you and Glenn have already done an emergency pod about the Trade Me Stuff news. So let's zoom in to this meeting. I thought it might be useful to just briefly recap the story to date, which, you know, sort of kicked off in February with this AFR story and has gone on until today's meeting. Yeah,
it's become a saga so sort of intricately plotted that I think even people like me started to kind of glaze over towards the end of it, but I'll give it the sort of relatively short version. So Jim Grenon, an expat Canadian who is often described as a billionaire, but Tim Murphy from Newsroom asked him the question straight up and you know, was congratulated by Grenon for being the first to actually ask whether that was true. I don't think he got a dead straight answer on it. It's often hard to measure the wealth of extremely wealthy individuals, but very rich guy, bought I think initially around just shy of 10% of NZME, and I think he's since got that up sort of 13-14% of it. And he did that with the intention of sort of shaking up the board. He then went round and spoke to other significant shareholders or people who represented, big blocks of shares, people who owned it on behalf of funds, that kind of thing, with a sort of a two-pronged critique of the company. He said that its performance wasn't great and that it wasn't getting enough value out of OneRoof, for example, its NZME's property portal, but also that NZME's journalism was not living up to a particular set of values, and that, were it to be sort of reformed, they could get more money out of that as well. And, it was controversial because he basically sought to initially knock out the whole board, and he also has history, albeit fairly minor history, as a media owner or funder with the Centrist, which is a sort of a news aggregator that has a fairly defined set of preoccupations, and so people are rightly concerned because they. The Herald's one of, if not the most important news organisation in the country, and there was this idea that a kind of a small group of people were sort of banding together to take control of it, and to what end, And this went back and forth in various kind of ways, and it felt for a while like the current board was really on the back foot. And eventually they moved the ASM, which was supposed to happen, I think, in late April or early May, moved it to today. And in that time, the current board and Grenon, they effectively negotiated a compromise in which most of the current board would stay on, but the chair, Barbara Chapman, would resign. A new board member would be elected, that's Steven Joyce, who would become chair, and Grenon himself would become part of the board, but some of the other people that he'd been advocating for, like Des Giddings, Philip Crump, wouldn't be joining the board. And, so this at various times looked like it would be an electric kind of battle, and there would be different factions, and it would be fiercely heated. It was relatively orderly, as it turned out, but still had to be in the room, and a fascinating spectacle to witness.
Yeah, and I think the fact that it was sort of not going to end up being, swords at dawn arrived about 3 weeks ago after the sort of compromise peace deal with Steven Joyce's nomination to the board sort of being approved and Jim Grenon pulling back on some of his nominations. Not a lot of people go to shareholder meetings. Not a lot of people go to annual general meetings. So do you want to describe what the vibe was like in there today?
Yeah, so it was held in the iHeart Lounge, which is the sort of like event space in the at the ground floor of the NZME building in the city. It was, for starters, it was incredibly cold. Like, I just cannot stress enough how cold it was and how drafty. Like, it had those kind of big, top-down air conditioners, and I was sort of under one. And if you were under one, you were really in it. Barbara Chapman was under one. She, said that she'd lost feeling in her hands by the end of it. Grenon was under one. He said it made him feel very unlikely. Like, I can't stress enough how much of an overriding reality that was constantly present in your mind was that it was incredibly cold. Part of me was like, is this deliberate to kind of speed things up? But if that was the case, it didn't really speed things up. It still ran to just shy of 2 hours as an event. I spoke to a couple of shareholders beforehand who were there well ahead of time. I do think shareholder meetings, they serve a lot of functions. They're very important for the governance and for shareholders to be represented. They're also entertainment for shareholders, often who might be retired, and this is quite an exciting moment for them. And so, but the ones I spoke to were like, this is a very well attended meeting, and that was 20 minutes before it started, when the room was probably only about half as full as it was going to get. The other thing that was interesting was, ahead of time, they said that journalists were barred from the meeting without express permission of the board. I sought and received permission to attend. There were other journalists there, Maria Slade from Business Desk, Hamish from NBR, maybe a couple of others, including briefly Heather Duplessis-Allen, and Shane Curry, obviously, who's also a reasonably substantial shareholder at NZME as well. But we were sort of off in the corner, and it's very much, it's an event for shareholders. It's not an event for media, even though media were there. The big crowd, relatively elderly crowd, I think it's fair to say. And I was thinking of you while I was watching, because the Readers and Writers Festival is an uncanny comp. Like, the number of incredibly long statements, which didn't even appear to pretend to have a question contained in them, was staggering. And I guess the tricky thing is, and I thought Barbara Chapman did a pretty good job in her final appearance as chair, is that they have every right to speak, but these things were like 7, 8, 9 minutes long, stuff that you wouldn't, I think at a certain point you would be shutting this down at even a Readers and Writers Festival event.
Oh, we would not let it go on that long. And we've actually circumvented that problem with the use of technology. So I can, chat with NZME's board about how
they do have that technology thing, but I think there are sort of fundamental and alienable rights of shareholders that you can show up and just start going.
Well, I guess it's their only chance to do that, right?
And to be fair to the shareholding body politic, there were some very good questions and some very interesting people asking questions, which I'm sure we'll get to. But this thing could easily have been done in an hour with a very few small kind of nips and tucks, and we might have all left a bit better informed and certainly warmer had that been the case.
So just top line, I guess, what happened at the board meeting in terms of the official procedure, all of which very well signalled in advance via, the notice of the AGM and what shareholders were being asked to vote on, but just outline, what happened.
So there were basically, there was a restating of the already announced financial results, no new information there. That was fine, interesting, but also familiar. Then the sort of meat of the meeting was the sort of the appointment of, so there was the resignation and then the reappointment of Sussan Turner, former MediaWorks CEO, who's been on the board for a term, but sought a second, received a second. 59% of the proxy votes, and they only needed a simple majority for any of these appointments, were already in hand. So none of them were particularly, irrespective of how the voting went in the room or online, this was already sort of done in advance. So Sussan Turner went first, outlined her credentials. They're impeccable. She's put up. She passes. And I think there was a single question. There's this guy, Stephen Mayne, who's like famous for asking the same question of literally every shareholder meeting in Australasia, but particularly focused on New Zealand about it's something to do with board remuneration being compulsory as a kind of an agenda item. Look, I'm mangling it, but it's, he asked it of her, and she was like, I got no ability to respond to that. Anyway, Steven Joyce is up next. Again, got a great media background through founding RadioWorks, which is now effectively the foundation of MediaWorks. A few more questions for him. He handled them very well. I think, you do as long in politics as he did, and you're just very comfortable in that kind of an environment. There were some people who, probably if I'm just making some broad generalizations here, there was like 3/4 of the room in terms of the people who spoke were people who were, I want maximised shareholder value. I broadly agree that this woke stuff's gone too far. That or had kind of quite narrow and sometimes kind of off-topic-y type questions. And then there were like 2 or 3 people who were kind of trying to voice the sort of misgivings of people who were like, this is a right-wing cabal taking over the institution. But both parties got to air their questions. Both, I think, would probably be reasonably satisfied if I had a guess at the answers they received. But Joyce sort of basically skates through, and then it's Grenon, and that's, for me, that was kind of why I was there. My colleague, our editor, Madeline Chapman, said, if you go try and get a photo of him, because he basically looks like a pixelated potato in every picture that's run of the guy.
There's like one picture of the guy that's been circulating for 4 months.
He's fishing.
He's on a boat.
And so to see him in I've had my eyes lasered. I can really see shit. And it was very high definition. He's just walking around. It's clearly not a potato. He's just like a bald guy.
Was he in a suit or like?
No, he was wearing like a sort of a casual, like a print shirt, untucked, skinny jeans, I think, business casual.
Okay.
Leaning towards the casual side of that. He was sat alongside Joyce, who was sat alongside Murray Kirkness, the recently elevated to the exec editor-in-chief of the Herald. I think he's maybe chief content officer might be his title now. But then he gets up to speak, and he starts off by basically saying, I've been on a ton of boards, which he has, and I've never had to basically pitch myself as part of that process.
For my supper,
yeah. So he did that, and he was quite disarming. I think for people who'd been sort of scared about this guy and that he'd be sort of, hellfire and brimstone, let's destroy woke media. There wasn't a lot to grab hold of there, but there was definitely some interesting stuff that went on.
And Bowen Pan, so he was appointed to the board, or is there sort of an after process where he will be?
Yeah, but Bowen Pan is the former senior executive at Facebook, considered the sort of, as I understand it, the architect of marketplace, which has become a very big business for them, or at the very least a huge driver of attention and data. But if he was there, I didn't see him, and he wasn't a sort of a formal resolution. My understanding is that after the event, the new board was going to have a sort of
like a conclave.
Yeah, like a little conclave, a little extraordinary meeting, and elect the business of which was to elect Joyce as chair, but also to bring Pan onto the board. I'm not a sophisticated enough business reporter to know why he wasn't part of the same kind of resolution structure as the rest, but that's. I think if you're a shareholder who's motivated by returns and is very interested in OneRoof, like a sort of a not a particularly partisan shareholder, then Grenon comes on. He is representing himself effectively as a very substantial shareholder. Joyce comes on as chair. That's he's got good experience. You can't really argue that. Pan coming on with knowing exactly what it took to grow Marketplace as a business. I think that's probably the most interesting one from a how do we get the maximum value out of OneRoof. And it's even more kind of germane because of the staff trade me type that was announced only hours previous.
Yeah, I think that's why his name kind of stuck out. And I think also his appointment signals a sort of a digital innovation and kind of view to the future. Not to say Joyce's and Grenon's don't, but that feels more like shareholder return and stabilisation rather than here's where we're headed, right? Were there any good questions from some of our shareholder attendees? We know Don Brash was there. It was reported by the Media Insider this morning. He was sounding fairly chipper about the direction of things.
Yeah, so Don Brash came up for the event. I chatted with him afterwards as well. So he is a relatively recent shareholder in NZME and did so effectively on principle because he had he wanted to know why advocacy ads, he represents Hobson's Pledge, who were previously able to advertising that in the wraparound of the print newspaper, were no longer considered admissible to that particular location. And so there were two answers to that. One by Chapman, who noted that when they ran the ad, the Hobson's Pledge ad on the front, as part of the wraparound in the same place that normally Harvey Norman owns in perpetuity, that they received a large number of cancellations, and when they considered whether they should. What they should do in response to that, and they decided they should no longer accept advocacy ads. If you recall, in the lead up to the election, I think the CTU did an anti-Luxon ad in the same position, which also caused a bit of an uproar. They said all advocacy ads, they can run inside the paper, they can't run on the wrap. And they said when they announced that, they also received a large number of cancellations. And Michael Boggs, the NZME CEO, made, I think, a pretty good point that the problem is that advocacy advertising looks quite different from fridge ads, and people can very easily distinguish, okay, that's a Harvey Norman ad, but advocacy ads a lot of the time has the appearance of editorial, and because the Herald sometimes does do kind of big striking, covers for a particular project or other, there are people who misinterpret an advocacy ad as an editorial project, and Brash was, I spoke to him afterwards. He was entirely satisfied with that answer.
I mean, just sensible, to be honest.
You kind of, like, media is a mucky business, and we make decisions that are contestable all the time. But that one just sort of seems to make sense in terms of, like, this is a complex thing. You got to figure it out. So there were a few other kind of. There was definitely like there were some really good questions asked of Roger Coleman, who's this like long-time Australian shareholder, represents about 10% of the shareholding, not necessarily his own, but in proxies. He was asking, we've got a very large shareholder on the board now who's going to see the 5-year plan, have information in real time, stuff that's not available to other shareholders. How he wanted the 5-year plan to be released as a one-time object, just to kind of have a level start line for all shareholders. And there were a bunch of other people who had interesting questions in that regard, but there were also some real buzzy questions too. Would you like to know some?
I want to know some of the buzzy questions.
So there's a guy there who wore a bright yellow T-shirt with like an oil drum on the back. He's a single issue shareholder, and that issue is, why won't the media talk to me about Marsden Point being shut? And that's like an interesting, that's an interesting story as far as I'm aware. It's one that the media covered quite well pre and post the shutdown, and probably do revisit from time to time. This guy is extremely...
He's dog with bones.
Yeah, he was like, why? I live in Northland. Whenever I go to the Whangarei, apologies, whenever I go to the Whangarei office, the doors...
Of the Northern Advocate.
The doors are locked. It looks like a big office. Why can't I come in and, and talk to the staff there? And I'm like, you might just have your answer with how profoundly you feel this question. There's someone else who, that was actually quite sad, but they were like complaining about like a Tally's shareholder, or maybe a Tegel shareholder meeting, where they were trying to talk about the export of chicken feet to China, and that Tim Hunter, and they considered that they'd been bullied by Tim Hunter and Jenny Ruth, both of whom worked for the NBR, and they were asking Barbara Chapman about what she could do about bullying by other members of the media, both of whom in this case worked for an entirely separate media organisation. She did seem quite upset, so I don't want to make light of her, but this is the kind of, that was a very long question that had to be heard, and also had no possibility of getting a satisfactory answer from a board that could not speak to it at all. So it's a real mix of interesting questions. The Grenon stuff, like he got more questions than anyone else, asked them reasonably well, but there's also just a whole bunch of just filler in the very, very cold room.
I mean, like this, I've got Simpsons episodes running through my brain right now, and episodes of Parks and Recs. But there is this incredible thing where it's like, this is business and commerce, and yet it's also a weird little microcosm of kind of a small democracy. Like, it feels like there are local government kind of parallels in terms of community meetings and stuff.
I think that's a really good way of understanding this, particularly given that it's very accessible in a way. To get here, you can, anyone can buy shares if you can afford them. It doesn't cost a lot to buy a very small parcel to be able to be in that room, and then you have the chance to ask any of the board a question, or just give a statement, and there are like really interesting stuff does come out. Like Grenon basically acknowledged that he didn't bring a particularly relevant media skills to the board, which he doesn't. He considers himself a generalist, and has sort of, that there are kind of principles that he applies to businesses that he acquires or acquires an interest in. And there is something to be said for, like, when you're really in the media business, there are things that you don't necessarily see that, a naive outsider might bring to light.
Lots of value in an outsider. But he quite often will lean into, drawing parallels between things he's done in his other businesses and how they're similar to journalism. And I can see how that kind of rankles people, but also there is a little bit of naivety there.
Yeah. And I think he I don't know whether he's workshopped those lines or something, but they were sort of relatively, he sort of knew how to pitch himself. He described himself in a very Canadian way, and he still has, he's in a boot, like he has that level of Canadian accent. And he described himself as an agitator, which I'd not heard of this. I've watched a little bit of hockey, but basically in the NHL, that's someone who basically just goes on there to sort of start a fight effectively. And he was sort of proudly claiming that as his position, as he's going to sort of challenge things. I spoke to him briefly afterwards, and he was basically like, he doesn't know if he went, paraphrasing here, he doesn't know if he went about it the right way in terms of it was a pretty full noise, chaotic way to achieve what he did today, but that he's not sure that it would have happened if he'd gone about it in a normal, orderly fashion, whether he might have achieved it. And I think there's probably something in that. And, I think it's totally understandable that people will have fears about Grenon. There were a number of questions asked about the editorial board, for example, which Philip Crump was also in the room. He's going to, be the chair of that. But, they sort of point, Grenon's one vote on this board. There's still Sussan Turner and Guy Horrocks who've been around for some time. Bowen Pan will be joining it. Steven Joyce, for all that, he's still, he said he's still a member of the National Party. He's also a fairly known quantity. There's only so much you can do as a 13-14% shareholder and a single vote on a board. And likewise, the volume that the Herald publishes, someone asked, what will the editorial board be able to do? And they don't know what that is, but it's pretty difficult. You've got dozens and dozens of journalists, and, maybe they'll be able to kind of fully politically reorient it, but I don't know. Have you met a journalist? They're quite hard to kind of tow in a particular direction.
Shocking statement. I guess the thing is that you're hoping for good faith, really, aren't you? From some smart people, some agitators. Grenon obviously felt like he just had to get on the ice and start a fight to end up kind of where we are.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so let's talk about this in light of Trade Me buying 50% of Stuff Digital, the announcement today. And so as a result of that, Stuff's property section will become Trade Me Property. So the classified marketplace, and I have had several small strokes trying to kind of line this up in a logical sequence with the Fairfax, Trade Me, inhale, exhale of that. It's a lot. But essentially the classified online marketplace has bought a stake in the news eyeball machine. I'm going to use that phrase because that's the phrase that Stuff used about Stuff.
Interesting
in their
phrase.
Press release today, eyeball machine. And then you've got NZME's One Roof, which is off sort of being assessed at the moment, and there's talk about that being split out. It feels like it says a lot about our two biggest commercial media brands that on the same day, accidentally probably, I don't know, who knows.
I don't think it's an accident from Stuff's side. I want to give them credit for the stagecraft there.
There's sort of, just kind of dived straight into the crowd, surfed the momentum. But, we are talking about our two biggest, journalism, many venerable mastheads between them, in the same conversation as the online classifieds property juggernauts, right? Like, what is this?
Yeah, the thing is, I can get too close to this stuff from a strategy business perspective and not see the wood for the trees, which is to say, this is where we are. That news organisations are so undervalued and vulnerable and so disconnected from their impact on society and their profitability so thin that they can be acquired. I don't want to say this is an afterthought for Trade Me, but it's not a particularly substantial, it doesn't outwardly appear like it's a particularly substantial transaction for them. And Likewise, a big thread of the NZME thing is we think that literally just by tearing one roof away from, these mastheads and this radio, that we can make it much more valuable, i.e. that it's just having its lifeblood sucked out of it
down
by being next to these disgusting mastheads. And, if you're a journalist and a writer and love the stuff like we do, it is a sad and portentous and kind of terrifying thing, even as, from another angle, it can be viewed as a potential dawn of value being reinvigorated in 10 years if Trademere, turn out to be right about their thesis of it. That both those things, I think, are true, and that's the sort of subtext of this day, that we're in a very strange place with our news organisations right now for both of these things to be happening.
That feels like a great place to leave this particular chat, lest we spend another hour and a half talking about the strategic rationale behind it all. I did just want to ask one fun question, one fun text kind of thing. You were at the New Zealand Music Awards on Thursday night.
I was.
So I thought it would be a good way to shift away from the business of media to talk about how they were.
I had a great time at the Aotearoa Music Awards. I must confess to, I think the way that they stage it they start the awards at, I think, 6:30, and then they have an hour intermission. I came during the intermission because, it's not it used to be a sort of round tables kind of formal but kind of chatty situation. Now it's, long rows of seating, and so it's less, I'm getting on. I don't know if I can do a 6:30 till 10 o'clock type award show with that format. But and they've obviously, these used to be the VNZMAs. They've lost that Vodafone now One NZ sponsorship. So it's less kind of full production noise than it once was. It's also, I think, bigger, in terms of the total number of people there. And I think that's probably the thing I find most, it just makes sure. I really enjoy the fact that it feels like really young. It feels like there are a ton of musicians there. There's a ton of musicians' family there. And it doesn't feel like a corporate awards show where the makers of the thing aren't in the room, which can sometimes happen with kind of creative sector award shows and other sort of situations like that. The performances were up and down for me. Stan Walker's was, I thought, amazing. I'm probably going to write something about this. I sort of, Bishop's reaction, obviously, you sort of, Toitu Tiriti is very closely tied to Te Pāti Māori. There's been lots of stuff to get through there, but as a performance and as a moment when they sort of walked in, that was just you could just feel the emotional temperature in the room sort of change quite radically. Also, Fazer Days played. She was stunning and deservedly won two of the major awards. And then Hori Shaw, Alex rightly singled this out in her write-up, but him coming on stage and just being he's wearing full kind of hunting camo, said that he still had blood on his, Crocs from yesterday. It was there's just something where you're this is not orderly or normal. This is not this couldn't happen in any other country in the world. And that's not always a good thing. There are some things about it that do feel a little bit, amateur, but there are also some things where you're this is so damn cute that this is, that this is the way that we present ourselves. And I really did enjoy the awards, and I think that they've got they've changed quite a lot from when I first started going 20 years or so ago, and they feel in some ways smaller, but but there's also something that's just, it's just got an enormous heart in it, the way that it's going now.
Brilliant. Okay, well, look, big day on the mic for you. So let's wrap it up. Thanks so much for coming to your own podcast and being a guest.
Thank you for hosting and interviewing me and not making it any weirder than it strictly had to be contractually. And also to Tia here for recording again today and editing tonight. Really appreciate you both.